Today we are traveling back to a sad day. It was July 9th in 1861 in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A woman named Fanny is sitting at the library table with her two small daughters, 7-year-old Edith and 10-year-old Allegra. And Fanny had just clipped little Edie's curls to make the summer heat more bearable, and she was melting sealing wax to seal the lock of hair in a packet, a small keepsake of her daughter, when a gentle summer breeze comes through the window, and suddenly Fanny is on fire. She ran to protect her daughters. She ran to the next room where her husband was working, and he grabbed a rug and tried to smother the flames. It didn't work, and he threw his arms around her and tried to smother the fire with his own body. And he burned his face and his hands and his arms horribly. And it was futile. Fanny died the next morning at the age of 43. And she was buried on what would have been their 18th wedding anniversary. Her husband was too badly burned to attend the funeral. And a month later, he wrote to Fanny's sister, "How am I alive after what my eyes have seen? I know not." Fanny's husband was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, the most celebrated poet in America. The famous beard in so many of his later portraits, the sage and distinguished look, reproduced in painting after painting, covered the scars from trying to save his wife's life. This was unfortunately not a freak accident. This was happening to women across New England and across the world every single day. And it was because of what women were required to wear. What Fanny was wearing, what thousands of women were wearing in 1861, was a crinoline, a wide hooped skirt built on a cage-like structure of horsehair and steel and layered with yards of voluminous, flammable fabric. The fashionable silhouette of the mid-19th century, worn by women of every social class, not just the wealthy. Working class women who spent all day near open fires wore them, women who climbed stairs and bent over hearths and reached past candles wore them. And when the fabric caught, because the fabric always caught eventually, the crinoline turned into a cone of fire around the woman, trapping her inside it, making it nearly impossible to escape or for anyone else to smother the flames. Between the 1850s and 1860s, an estimated 3,000 women in England died from their crinolines catching fire. In 1864, the New York Times reported that 40,000 women worldwide had perished from crinoline-related fires. In March of 1958, the same newspaper reported the death of a young woman from Boston whose crinoline had caught fire, and noted in the same article that 19 similar deaths had been reported in London in the previous 2 months alone. In 1861, the same year that Fanny Longfellow died, 6 ballet dancers died when they tried to help a colleague whose costume had caught fire. Their costumes caught fire too, and all 6 died. In 1865, 2 women in New York came too close to a hot stove. Their dresses caught fire. They died. They were not named in their death notice, just 2 women burned to death, not named. In 1871, Mary and Emily Wilde, Oscar Wilde's half-sisters, attended a Halloween party in Ireland. One sister's dress brushed against a candle while she was dancing. The other sister rushed to help her. Her crinoline caught fire too, and both died. In 1867, the Archduchess Matilde of Austria was hiding a cigarette behind her back to conceal it from her father. The lit cigarette caught her dress. She died for hiding a cigarette from her father in a dress that she was required by society to wear. The 2 unnamed women in New York who were not named in their death notice, just 2 women. That anonymity is part of the story. The scale of what was happening was large enough that 2 women burning to death in front of their families didn't even merit their names in the newspaper. The dangers of crinoline were not unknown. Critics spoke out. Newspapers reported the deaths. One publication suggested, apparently without any awareness of how inadequate this was, that every lady wearing a crinoline should be accompanied by a footman with a pail of water. After After the Civil War, ministers began preaching against crinolines with considerable urgency, not because thousands of women had burned to death in them, but because wide skirts increased the risk of men seeing a woman's undergarments or bare skin, perhaps an ankle. The modesty argument gained traction where the safety argument did not. The crinoline faded from fashion in the 1870s, was replaced by the bustle, not because it was killing women, but because it risked revealing their undergarments. That tells you something about whose interests were being protected, and it probably doesn't surprise you. But killer fashion didn't stop there. Oh no, my friends. In 1861, the same year Fanny Longfellow died, the same year the 6 ballet dancers died, a 19-year-old artificial flower maker named Matilda Schurer died. She convulsed, she vomited, she foamed at the mouth in a harsh shade of green. There was arsenic in her liver, her lungs, her stomach. Even the whites of her eyes had turned green. She was a 19-year-old flower maker, and she dyed green, the color of a fashionable dress. I do not think it was a coincidence that the main color in The Wizard of Oz was green. In the late 18th century, a chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele had discovered that mixing arsenic with copper created a startlingly bright emerald green. It was vibrant. It didn't fade. It was adopted in everything: clothing, wallpaper, artificial flowers, playing cards, candles, the arsenic-laced wreaths that women wore in their hair, the green gloves on their hands, the green shoes on their feet. The British Medical Journal warned that a woman wearing a green dress would carry in her skirts enough arsenic to poison everyone in the room. The dangers were known by the 1860s. The dyes were still being used. The women were still dying. The flower makers, the girls who spent their days dusting artificial flowers with green arsenic-laden powder, were the ones dying fastest. Like Matilda Schurer, 19 years old, foaming at the mouth in green. In 1862, an engraving showed a skeleton gentleman at a ball asking a skeleton lady to dance, and it was meant to represent the arsenic dyes. It was meant to be a warning. The fashion continued anyway. I just today finished reading a book called Stars on the Sea by F. Van Wyck Mason, which takes place during the American Revolution. And I found this passage and I immediately knew what was going on with this. So this is a young, fashionable lady, and it says about her, comically, the gay flowers on Lucy's hat drooped over one ear, and a bright green trickle meandered over one cheek and down her neck until the dye had spread into the sodden white muslin of her kerchief. Comically, we know what was going on there. By the way, it's a really good book. Tons of obscure historical details. So if you love that stuff, oh yeah, it's good. It's really good. But let's move on to other deadly fashion, shall we? The fires killed quickly. But another fashion necessity, the corset, killed slowly, and it started in childhood. Girls were corseted from a young age. A developing girl's skeleton could be permanently deformed by years of compression, ribs pushed into abnormal positions, the liver displaced and flattened, the lungs unable to fully inflate. The fashionable silhouette required the compression, and the compression began before the body had even finished forming. The Victorian convention of women fainting, so often presented as evidence of feminine delicacy, romanticized in novel after novel, was not delicacy. It was the physiological consequence of not being able to breathe properly. Women who couldn't fully inflate their lungs because they had been corseted from childhood fainted because their bodies were running short of air. I want that to be clear because it has been obscured by a century and a half of romanticizing this era. This was not delicacy. This was damage. Corsets also caused miscarriages. They contributed to difficult childbirths. Any midwife working in 19th century New England would have seen the consequences in delivery after delivery, the damage that had been done to women's bodies long before they ever arrived at the door to give birth. Women topped the corset with as much as 40 pounds of clothing. A fashionable woman changed dresses multiple times a day. Each change, another corseting, the damage accumulated over a lifetime, from childhood to old age, because the silhouette required it. And that brings us to our next fashion craze. And here's the detail that stops me every time I think about it. And I think about it way more than you might believe. The disease that was devastating New England families throughout the 19th century, tuberculosis, they called it consumption. The disease that took Henry David Thoreau and his sister Helen and spawned the vampire panic, which I'll do in another video. It was considered beautiful. The hectic flush, the bright eyes, the pale skin, the flushed cheeks that appeared just before the end was the fashionable look. The slightly wasted appearance of someone in the late stages of a fatal illness was what women were attempting to achieve. They ingested arsenic in small doses to achieve the fashionable pallor. They used belladonna drops, deadly nightshade, to make their eyes bright and dilated. They cultivated deliberately the look of someone who was dying of the most feared disease in New England. The disease that was killing people around them was the look they were trying to achieve. I think about this every time someone describes the Victorian era as romantic. Now, by the late 19th century, millions of small songbirds were killed every year to decorate women's hats. The feathers of egrets and herons and songbirds, sometimes entire birds mounted whole, adorned the fashionable hat. Multiple species came close to extinction. Arsenic was used to preserve the mounted birds for display. The hats were beautiful. Some historic hats in museum collections today are still hazardous. The arsenic in the birds that decorated them never went away. The Audubon Society was founded in large part as a response to the hat trade. The songbirds were disappearing from New England skies because they were ending up on women's heads. And the men who made the top hats that fashionable men wore were slowly going mad. Mercury was used to process the fur felt. Chronic mercury poisoning produced tremors, mood swings, hallucinations. Mad as a Hatter was not a figure of speech. It was a description of what actually happened to hat makers. Lewis Carroll named his character after them. He knew exactly what he was describing. The phrase has outlasted the reason for it. Fashion was killing the makers as surely as it was killing the wearers. Now, these women and men were not making frivolous choices. They were wearing what was required of them, what was fashionable, what was expected for a respectable public life. What was, in many cases, the only option available if they wanted to move through the world without social consequences. The corset that deformed their organs from childhood was required. The crinoline that would catch fire from a summer breeze was a fashionable silhouette. The green dress that contained enough arsenic to poison a room was the color of the season. The look of someone dying of consumption was what beauty was supposed to be. And when the critics spoke, when they raised their voices about these fashions, they spoke mostly about modesty, about what men might see, about propriety and decorum and the risk of social disorder. The thousands of women dying in flammable dresses were a lesser concern than the possibility of a man glimpsing a woman's undergarments. The two unnamed women in New York were not named in their death notice. The 6 ballet dancers who died trying to help a colleague were unremarked by most of the press. The girls in the flower-making workshops foaming at the mouth in green were replaced by the next girl who needed the work. And fashions in the 1800s were beautiful, and they were killing women. And that was largely treated as an acceptable cost of looking the way women were expected to look. Fanny Crosby is buried at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She was buried on what would have been her 18th wedding anniversary. And Henry grew that famous beard to cover the scars, and he wrote, "How am I alive after what my eyes have seen? I know not." Matilda Scherer was 19 years old. She foamed at the mouth in green, and the fashionable dresses kept being made in green, and other girls took her place in the flower making workshops because fashion continued. The color was beautiful. And all of that is part of the story. The scale of what was happening to women in the fashions of the 19th century was large enough that 2 deaths could pass without names, just 2 women burned to death. Moving on, 40,000 women died from flammable dresses by 1864. And the ministers preached about what men might see if the skirts blew the wrong way. The fashions were beautiful. The cost was ugly. Being a slave to fashion, worth it? You decide. And I'll see you again somewhere in time.